Rebecca Martinez was 38 years old when the certified letter arrived at her apartment in Sacramento. She taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary, and she'd been teaching there for 12 years. The envelope was thick, official, and came from a law office in Reno she'd never heard of. She opened it standing in her kitchen, still wearing her work clothes, her bag still on her shoulder. The letter informed her that her uncle, Thomas Garrett, had passed away 6 months earlier. Rebecca barely remembered him. He was her mother's older brother, someone she'd met maybe 3 times in her entire life. The last time was at her mother's funeral, almost 15 years ago. He'd shown up late, said a few words, and left early. That was it. She hadn't thought about him since, but now, according to the letter, he'd left her something: 80 acres of land in rural Nevada, about 2 hours outside of Reno. The letter included coordinates, a rough map, and a property deed that needed her signature. There was no house on the land, no structures at all, just dirt, rocks, and sagebrush. The lawyer's letter was polite but clear. The estate had been settled. The land was hers if she wanted it. If she didn't, she could disclaim it, and it would revert to the state. Rebecca sat down at her kitchen table and stared at the papers. 80 acres sounded like a lot, but she had no idea what that actually meant. She pulled out her phone and looked up the coordinates. The satellite image showed nothing but brown and grey. No roads, no buildings, no water. Just empty desert stretching in every direction. Her first thought was to disclaim it. She didn't need land in the middle of nowhere. She didn't have time to deal with it. She was barely keeping up with her bills as it was. Her apartment rent had gone up twice in the last 3 years. Her car needed new tires. She had student loans that wouldn't die. The idea of inheriting something felt like it should be good news, but this didn't feel like good news. It felt like a problem. She called the law office the next morning during her lunch break. The attorney, a man named Richard Holbrook, answered on the second ring. His voice was calm and professional. Rebecca asked him the obvious question: what was the land worth? Holbrook paused. He told her he wasn't a real estate agent, but based on comparable sales in the area, the land was worth somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000. Maybe a little more if she found the right buyer. It was remote. No utilities, no access road, just raw land. Rebecca did the math in her head. $10,000 would clear 2 of her credit cards and cover the car repair. It wasn't life-changing, but it was something. She asked Holbrook how quickly she could sell it. He told her he could connect her with a local realtor who specialized in rural properties. If she wanted to move fast, she could probably have a buyer within a month. Maybe sooner. People bought land like that for off-grid projects, hunting camps, or just to hold as an investment. Rebecca thanked him and hung up. She spent the rest of the day thinking about it. By the time she got home that evening, she'd made her decision. She'd sell it. There was no reason to hold on to land she'd never use. But that night, lying in bed, she kept thinking about her uncle. She didn't know anything about his life. She didn't know why he'd lived out there, or why he'd left the land to her. She didn't even know if he'd liked her. The whole thing felt strange, unfinished. The next day, she called Holbrook again. She asked if her uncle had lived on the land. Holbrook said no. Thomas had lived in a small rental house in Reno. The land had been in his name for over 30 years, but as far as Holbrook knew, he'd never built anything on it. He'd just held on to it. Rebecca asked why. Holbrook didn't know. He said Thomas had been a quiet man, kept to himself, didn't talk much about his past. When he'd drafted his will, he'd been very clear that the land should go to Rebecca, but he hadn't explained why. Rebecca hung up and stared at the map again. Something about it bothered her. Why would someone hold on to 80 acres of worthless desert for 30 years? Why not sell it? Why leave it to her? She made a decision that surprised even herself. She decided to see it. That weekend, she drove to Nevada. It took just over 3 hours. She followed the coordinates on her phone, turning off the main highway onto a dirt road that barely qualified as a road. Her sedan rattled over rocks and ruts. Dust rose in clouds behind her. She passed no other cars, no houses, no signs of life. When she reached the coordinates, she stopped the car and got out. The silence was immediate and absolute. No wind, no birds, just heat and stillness. She looked around. The land stretched flat in every direction, broken only by low hills in the distance. The ground was hard-packed dirt and scattered rocks. Sagebrush dotted the landscape, grey-green and brittle. She walked. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she walked anyway. The sun was brutal. She'd brought water, but she was already sweating through her shirt. She climbed a low rise and looked back at her car. It looked small and out of place. That's when she saw it. A depression in the ground, maybe 20 feet across, partially filled with rocks and debris. It wasn't natural. The edges were too straight. She walked closer. The rocks weren't random. They'd been placed there, deliberately. She crouched down and moved a few aside. Underneath, she found wood. Old wood, grey and splintered, but definitely wood. Her heart started beating faster. She pulled out more rocks. The wood formed a frame, a collapsed frame. This had been something, a structure, maybe a shaft. She stood up and looked around with new eyes. There were other depressions, 3 more that she could see, all of them filled in, all of them hidden unless you knew what to look for. She pulled out her phone and took pictures. Then she walked to the next depression and did the same thing. Same story, collapsed wood frame, rocks piled on top. Someone had tried to hide these. Rebecca sat down on a rock and tried to think. This land had been mined. A long time ago, but it had been mined. That meant there'd been something here worth digging for. Gold, probably. Nevada was full of old gold mines. Most of them played out 100 years ago, but someone had worked this land. Her uncle had known that. He had to have known that. She drove back to Sacramento that night with her mind racing. The next morning, she didn't call the realtor. She called a geologist. His name was Dr. Martin Chen, and he worked as an independent consultant. She found him through a university website. She explained the situation. She sent him the photos. She asked him if he could tell her what she was looking at. Chen called her back 2 days later. He said the depressions were consistent with early mining activity, probably from the 1800s. The style of the shaft suggested hand-dug operations, which meant small-scale prospectors, not industrial mining companies. That was actually good news. Industrial operations would have stripped everything of value. Small operations were less thorough. They followed the easiest veins and left the rest. Rebecca asked the question she'd been afraid to ask. Could there still be gold there? Chen said maybe. He couldn't promise anything without seeing the land in person and doing proper testing, but if the original miners had been working by hand, they would have stopped when the easy gold ran out. That didn't mean the gold was gone. It just meant it got harder to reach. Rebecca asked what it would cost to find out. Chen said he could do a preliminary survey for $1,500. That would include soil sampling, a magnetometry scan to look for underground voids or mineral concentrations, and a written report. If the results looked promising, they could talk about next steps. $1,500. Rebecca didn't have $1,500. Not without putting it on a credit card she was already trying to pay off. She thanked Chen and told him she'd think about it. She didn't sleep that night. She kept running the numbers in her head. If she sold the land now, she'd get maybe $10,000, clear some debt, go back to her regular life, safe, predictable, tight. But if there was gold there, real gold, even a small amount, it could be worth so much more. The next morning, she called Chen back and hired him. He met her at the property 2 weeks later. He arrived in a truck loaded with equipment. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with sunburned skin and dirt under his fingernails. He walked the land with her, taking notes, marking locations with small flags. He used a handheld device that beeped and clicked as he waved it over the ground. He took soil samples from a dozen different spots, sealing each one in a labeled bag. The whole process took 6 hours. Rebecca sat in the shade of her car and watched him work. She'd taken the day off from school. She'd told her principal it was a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. When Chen finished, he came over and sat down next to her. He was covered in dust. He drank half a bottle of water in one go and then looked at her. He said the land was interesting. Very interesting. Rebecca's heart jumped. She asked what that meant. Chen said the soil samples showed elevated levels of gold, Not surface gold. You weren't going to find nuggets lying around, but the concentrations were high enough to suggest a subsurface vein. The magnetometry scan had picked up anomalies consistent with unmined quartz deposits. Quartz and gold often occurred together. Rebecca asked how much gold. Chen said he couldn't tell her that, not without core drilling, which was expensive and invasive, but based on what he'd seen, he thought there was a real possibility of a viable deposit. Maybe not a fortune, but maybe not nothing either. He told her the next step would be core sampling. That would cost around $8,000. It would give them a much clearer picture of what was down there and how much of it there was. Rebecca felt dizzy. $8,000. She'd just spent $1,500. She didn't have $8,000. She didn't have $800. She asked Chen what he would do if it was his land. Chen looked out at the desert. He said honestly he'd drill. The indicators were strong enough that walking away felt like a mistake, but he also said she needed to be realistic. Most mineral deposits weren't economically viable to extract. Even if there was gold, it might cost more to get it out than it was worth. Rebecca drove home that night in silence. Her mind was a storm. She couldn't afford to drill, but she couldn't afford not to know. She spent the next week looking at her finances. She had a retirement account. A small one, about $12,000. She could take it out. There'd be penalties and taxes, but she could do it. Everyone she talked to told her not to. Her best friend, Angela, told her she was being crazy. Her father, who she called for the first time in months, told her to sell the land and forget about it. Her principal, who she confided in during a weak moment, told her that teachers didn't become gold miners, but Rebecca couldn't let it go. Something about the land had gotten into her head. The idea that her uncle had held onto it for 30 years. The idea that he'd left it to her for a reason. The idea that there was something under that dirt that could change everything. She cashed out her retirement account. She hired Chen to do the core drilling. It took 3 weeks to get the equipment out there, and another week to complete the drilling. Chen brought in a partner, a drilling specialist named Tom Broussard. They set up a portable rig and drilled 4 cores at different locations across the property. Each hole went down 100 feet. Rebecca couldn't be there for most of it. She had to work. She had to teach. She had to pretend like her entire future wasn't sitting in a hole in the desert. Chen called her on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in the middle of a parent-teacher conference. She excused herself and took the call in the hallway. Chen's voice was careful, controlled. He said they'd found something. Rebecca's legs went weak. She leaned against the wall. She asked what. Chen said the core samples showed a quartz vein running at an angle under the property. It was deeper than the original miners had dug, which explained why they'd missed it. The vein was narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, but it ran long, possibly across the entire property, and it was rich, very rich. Rebecca couldn't breathe. She asked how rich. Chen said preliminary assays showed concentrations between 0.8 and 1.2 ounces of gold per ton of ore. That was high, commercially viable high. If the vein ran the length they thought it did, and if the concentrations held, she could be looking at a significant deposit. Rebecca asked what significant meant. Chen said they needed to do more work to be sure, but based on conservative estimates, the extractable gold could be worth somewhere between $3 and $5 million, maybe more. Rebecca sat down on the floor. She couldn't stand anymore. She asked if he was sure. Chen said he was sure about the vein. He was sure about the concentrations. What he wasn't sure about was the extraction cost. Getting the gold out would require equipment, labor, permits, and time. That would eat into the value. But even after expenses, she'd be looking at a substantial profit. Rebecca thanked him and hung up. She sat in the school hallway for 10 minutes staring at nothing. Then she went back into the conference and finished talking about a 9-year-old's reading level. That night, she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the number. $3 to $5 million. It didn't feel real. Nothing felt real. The next morning, she called Chen and asked what happened next. Chen said she had options. She could sell the mineral rights to a mining company. They'd pay her a percentage of the extracted value, usually between 10 and 20%. That was the safest option. No risk. Guaranteed payout, but lower return. Or she could finance the extraction herself, hire a mining contractor. Oversee the operation. Keep all the profits. But that was risky. Extraction could run into problems, costs could spiral, permits could be denied. She could end up with nothing. Or she could find a partner, someone with experience and capital, split the costs and the profits, middle ground. Rebecca asked what he recommended. Chen said honestly, for someone in her position, selling the rights made the most sense. It was clean, simple. She'd walk away with a check and no headaches. But Rebecca didn't want to walk away with a check. She wanted the gold, all of it. She spent the next month learning everything she could about gold extraction. She read articles, she watched videos. She called people who had no reason to talk to her and asked them questions anyway. She found out that small-scale extraction operations were possible. Expensive, but possible. She found out that Nevada had an established permitting process for small mines. She found out that there were contractors who specialized in exactly this kind of project. She also found out that she was broke. She'd spent everything on the surveys and drilling. She had no money left, no savings, no retirement, nothing. She needed capital, a lot of it. Conservative estimates put the extraction costs at around $600,000. That included equipment rental, labor, permitting, environmental assessments, and a safety margin for unexpected problems. Rebecca didn't know anyone with $600,000. She didn't know anyone who knew anyone with $600,000. She tried banks. They laughed at her. She was a schoolteacher, with no collateral and no experience in mining. She tried private lenders. They wanted interest rates that would eat up any profit. She tried pitching investors. They wanted control she wasn't willing to give up. Weeks turned into months. Rebecca kept teaching, kept living in her apartment, kept driving her car with the bald tires, but every spare moment was spent trying to figure out how to make this work. Then, one afternoon, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and direct. Her name was Laura Simmons, and she represented a private equity group that specialized in small mining ventures. She'd heard about Rebecca's property through Chen, who'd mentioned it in a consultants forum. Simmons said her group was interested in discussing a partnership. Rebecca's first instinct was suspicion, but she agreed to meet. They met at a coffee shop in Reno. Simmons was in her 50s, dressed in business casual, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. She didn't waste time. She said her group had reviewed Chen's reports. They were impressed. They wanted to finance the extraction in exchange for 40% of the net profits. Rebecca said no. She wanted to keep control. She wanted the majority. Simmons smiled. She said everyone wanted to keep control, but control without capital was worthless. She offered a different deal. Her group would cover all extraction costs, all permits, all labor, all equipment. Rebecca would retain 60% ownership. The group would take 40%. They'd handle the operation. Rebecca would have approval rights on major decisions, but she wouldn't have to do the work. Rebecca asked what the catch was. Simmons said there was no catch, but there was risk. If the vein didn't pan out, if extraction costs exceeded projections, if something went wrong, Rebecca wouldn't owe them anything, but she wouldn't make anything either. The group would absorb the loss. Rebecca took the deal. The permitting process took 4 months. Environmental assessments, water rights reviews, historical surveys to make sure they weren't disturbing anything protected. It was slow and bureaucratic and frustrating, but Simmons's team handled it. Rebecca signed papers and waited. The extraction began in late spring. A crew of 8 men and 2 massive machines moved onto the property. They set up a temporary camp. They brought in a generator. They started digging. Rebecca visited every weekend. She'd drive out early Saturday morning and spend the day watching them work. The crew was professional, efficient. They followed the vein, pulling out ore and running it through a portable processing unit on site. The gold was separated, smelted into rough bars, and locked in a secure container. Every week there was more. The process took 6 months. By the end, they'd extracted just over 9,000 ounces of gold. At current market prices, that was worth approximately $4.2 million. After extraction costs, permitting fees, contractor payments, and Simmons's group's 40%, Rebecca's share came to $2.3 million. The check arrived on a Tuesday. Rebecca was at school when the email came through. She opened it on her phone during recess. She stared at the number. She read it 3 times, then she walked outside, sat on a bench and cried. She didn't tell anyone right away. She finished the school year. She kept living in her apartment. She kept driving her car. But inside, everything had changed. She paid off her student loans, all of them. She paid off her credit cards. She bought a new car. Not fancy, just reliable. She put a down payment on a small house in a quiet neighborhood. She set up a trust for her niece's college fund. She donated $50,000 to her school's arts program, anonymously. And she kept teaching. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. People asked her why. Why keep working? Why not retire, travel, do something else? Rebecca told them she liked teaching. She liked her students. She liked her life. The money didn't change who she was. It just meant she didn't have to worry anymore. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she'd think about the land. About the 80 acres of desert that everyone told her to sell. About the uncle she barely knew who'd held onto it for 30 years. About the decision to spend her last dollar drilling holes in the ground. She thought about how close she'd come to walking away, how easy it would have been to take the $10,000 and move on. How many people would have done exactly that? And she thought about what was still out there, in deserts, in basements, in old houses and forgotten fields, fortunes that no one knows about, fortunes waiting for someone to pay attention, someone to take a risk, someone to dig a little deeper. Rebecca kept the land. The vein had been extracted, but the property was still hers. She visited it sometimes, stood in the silence, remembered what it felt like when it was worthless. She never forgot that feeling, the feeling of not knowing, of risking everything, of being terrified and hopeful at the same time, because that feeling, more than the money, was what changed her life. Now, if you've made it this far in the story, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Stories like Rebecca's remind us that opportunity doesn't always look like opportunity. Sometimes it looks like a problem. Sometimes it looks like a risk nobody else wants to take. If you're enjoying these stories about people who found fortunes hiding in plain sight, consider subscribing to Fortune Beneath. We bring you these incredible true accounts every week. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Because you never know when the next one might change how you see the world around you. Rebecca's story spread quietly through certain circles, not in the news, not in headlines, but among geologists, among mineral rights investors, among people who pay attention to land that other people ignore. Chen called her a year later. He'd been contacted by a mining history researcher who was mapping old prospecting sites in Nevada. The researcher had found records of Rebecca's land, records from 1873. A prospector named James Dalton had filed a claim on that exact location. He'd worked it for 2 years, pulled out a small fortune in surface gold, and then abandoned it. The record said he'd left because the vein went too deep. His equipment couldn't follow it. Rebecca asked Chen what that meant. Chen said it meant Dalton had known the gold was there. He'd found the vein. He just couldn't reach it. So he'd moved on. And for 150 years, the gold had just sat there, waiting. Rebecca thought about that a lot. About Dalton working by hand, getting so close and having to walk away. About her uncle, somehow knowing or suspecting, but never having the resources to confirm it. About the generations of people who'd owned that land, or could have owned it, and never knew what was underneath. She thought about how many places were like that. How many pieces of land, how many old properties, how many forgotten corners held something valuable that no one had bothered to look for. The money changed Rebecca's life in practical ways. No more debt, no more anxiety about rent increases or car repairs or medical bills. But the real change was deeper than that. It was the knowledge that things could be different, that the life you're living isn't the only life available to you. That sometimes the thing everyone tells you is worthless is the most valuable thing you'll ever touch. Rebecca stayed in Sacramento. She stayed at Lincoln Elementary, but she started investing, small amounts at first, learning, buying old properties at tax auctions, hiring surveyors, looking for the things other people missed. Some of them were nothing, empty lots that stayed empty. But twice more she found something, not gold, but value, overlooked value. She learned to trust her instincts. Learned to recognize the feeling of possibility that everyone else called foolishness. Her friends still didn't understand. Angela, who'd told her not to drill, asked her once why she kept taking risks. Why not just enjoy the money? Relax? Rebecca said she wasn't taking risks anymore. She was paying attention. There was a difference. The truth was that the desert had taught her something. It had taught her that most people stop looking too soon. They see the surface. They see what's obvious. They make quick decisions based on incomplete information, and they walk away from things that could change everything. Rebecca didn't want to be that person anymore. She didn't want to be someone who walked away. Years passed. The initial rush of the discovery faded into memory. Rebecca's life became normal again, comfortable, stable, but different. She had options now, freedom, the ability to say no, the ability to say yes. She thought about her uncle sometimes, Thomas Garrett, the quiet man who'd lived alone and died alone and left her 80 acres of dirt. She wished she'd known him, wished she'd asked him why he'd held on to the land, what he'd known, what he'd hoped for. She visited his grave once. It was in a small cemetery outside Reno, simple headstone, no flowers. She stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to say. Finally, she just said thank you, because he'd given her more than land. He'd given her a chance, a choice, the opportunity to see something differently than everyone else saw it, and she'd taken it. That was the difference, not the gold, not the money, the choice, the willingness to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than what appeared on the surface. Rebecca kept the property deed in a frame on her wall, not as a trophy, as a reminder that the world is full of overlooked things, full of possibilities that look like problems, full of fortunes hiding in plain sight, and all you have to do is be willing to look, really look, not with your eyes but with your mind, not at what's obvious, but at what's possible, because somewhere right now, someone is standing on top of something valuable. They just don't know it yet. They're about to walk away, about to sell for pennies, about to let it go because everyone told them it wasn't worth the trouble. And maybe it isn't. Maybe 9 times out of 10 it's exactly what it looks like. Nothing. But that 10th time, that one time when everyone's wrong and you're right, when the thing they said was worthless turns out to be worth millions, that's the time that changes everything. Rebecca learned that. She lived it. And now she couldn't unsee it. Everywhere she looked, she saw potential. Not in some naive, wishful thinking way, but in a clear-eyed, calculated way. She saw properties that were priced wrong, land that was misunderstood, opportunities that required work and risk and patience that most people didn't have. She kept teaching because she loved it, but she kept investing because she'd learned how. And every time she bought a piece of overlooked land, every time she hired a surveyor, every time she took a calculated risk based on incomplete information, she thought about that first drive into the desert, about standing in the silence and heat and looking at nothing, at 80 acres of dirt that everyone said was worthless. She thought about the moment she decided to dig, not physically, not herself, but to invest in the possibility that there was more there than what met the eye. That was the moment everything changed, not when she found the gold, when she decided to look for it, because finding things requires looking, really looking, and most people don't. Most people take what they're told, accept what's obvious, move on quickly. Rebecca used to be that person. Before the letter, before the land, before the choice, but not anymore. Now she was someone who looked deeper, who questioned assumptions, who understood that value often hides in places where no one thinks to look. The desert taught her that. The 80 acres of nothing that turned into millions, the inheritance everyone told her to sell, the risk everyone told her not to take. She thought about alternate versions of her life. The version where she'd sold immediately, taken the $10,000, paid off some debt, gone back to normal. That version of Rebecca would still be teaching, still be stressed about money, still be living paycheck to paycheck. That version of Rebecca would never know what was under that desert, would never know that she'd been 30 signatures away from walking away from millions. The thought made her shiver. How close she'd come. How easy it would have been. She wondered how many people had stood where she'd stood, how many had inherited land or bought property, or stumbled onto something valuable and walked away because it didn't look like anything special. She wondered how much gold was still out there, how much money, how many fortunes buried under dirt or hidden behind walls or sitting in storage units or locked in old safes, how much value existed in the world that no one had claimed yet because no one had looked hard enough. Rebecca didn't have the answer, but she knew it was more than most people thought, way more. Because the world was full of James Daltons, people who'd found something valuable and couldn't quite reach it, people who'd known something was there but didn't have the tools or time or resources to get it. And the world was full of Thomas Garretts, people who'd held on to things for decades, hoping someone would eventually figure it out. And now it was full of Rebeccas, people who'd taken the chance, who'd looked when others didn't, who'd risked everything on incomplete information and won. Not everyone won. Rebecca knew that. Most mineral surveys came back negative. Most old properties were exactly as worthless as they looked. Most risks didn't pay off, but some did. And when they did, they paid off big. Big enough to change everything, big enough to turn a struggling teacher into a millionaire, big enough to rewrite your entire future. Rebecca understood now that wealth wasn't just about working hard. It wasn't even about being smart. It was about seeing things differently, about recognizing value that others missed, about being willing to bet on yourself when everyone else told you not to. She'd done that. Once. And it had worked. And now her whole life was different, not just financially, though that mattered, but deeper than that. She walked through the world differently now, more confident, more aware, more willing to trust her instincts. She saw opportunities everywhere, in conversations, in newspaper articles, in places people complained about or dismissed. She'd developed a radar for overlooked value, and she'd learned that the biggest opportunities were always the ones that looked least like opportunities, the ones that required work and risk and patience, the ones that scared people away, like 80 acres of desert that came with no roads, no water, and no obvious value. Like a property that a dozen people could have claimed over the years but no one wanted. Like land that a quiet old man had held onto for 30 years for reasons no one understood. Until Rebecca. Until someone finally looked close enough to see what was really there. That was the secret. Not luck, not magic, just attention, just the willingness to question the obvious answer and dig deeper. Rebecca thought about that every day. Thought about how her life had split into before and after. Before the letter, after the desert, before the risk, after the gold. She thought about sharing her story, about writing it down or posting it online or telling people what had happened, but something stopped her. Some instinct that this was private, personal, not a story for strangers. But she did tell her students, not the details, not the numbers, but the lesson. She told them that sometimes the most valuable things look like nothing at all, that sometimes you have to trust yourself even when everyone disagrees, that sometimes you have to take a risk on something you believe in even if you can't prove it yet. She told them this because she wished someone had told her, before she was 38, before she spent 12 years playing it safe, before the letter forced her to choose. She told them because she wanted them to recognize their own deserts when they came, their own inheritances that didn't look like inheritances, their own moments where everyone told them to walk away. She wanted them to be ready, to know that the safe choice wasn't always the right choice, that sometimes the thing everyone called crazy was actually the smartest thing you could do. Rebecca kept teaching, kept investing, kept living her new life that looked almost exactly like her old life, except completely different. And sometimes late at night, she'd drive out to the desert, to her 80 acres, to the land that had changed everything. She'd park where she'd parked that first time, get out, stand in the silence. The holes had been filled in. The equipment was gone. The crew had restored the land as close to its original state as possible. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never know anything had happened there. But Rebecca knew. She remembered. She stood there and looked at the empty desert and saw what no one else could see. Millions of dollars pulled from underneath. A fortune that had waited 150 years for someone to claim it. And she thought about all the other deserts, all the other overlooked places, all the other fortunes still waiting. Because this story wasn't unique. Rebecca knew that now. It wasn't special. It was just rare. Rare because most people didn't look. Most people didn't try. Most people sold quickly and moved on and never knew what they'd missed. But a few people did. A few people took the chance, hired the geologist, spent the money, took the risk. And for those few, everything changed. Rebecca was one of them, one of the few, one of the lucky ones who'd been given a chance and taken it. She'd never forget that, never take it for granted, never stop looking for the next opportunity that everyone else missed. Because once you learned to see value where others saw nothing, you couldn't unsee it. The world became different, full of possibilities, full of potential, full of fortunes hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to pay attention. Before we close, I want to thank you again for watching Fortune Beneath. Stories like Rebecca's remind us that extraordinary outcomes often start with ordinary circumstances and one crucial decision to see things differently. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. These stories are about more than money. They're about courage, instinct, and the willingness to look deeper when everyone else looks away. Drop a comment and let me know what you would have done in Rebecca's position. Would you have sold immediately, or would you have taken the risk? I read every comment, and I'm genuinely curious. Thank you for being here. Until the next story, keep your eyes open. You never know what might be right beneath your feet. Rebecca stood in the desert one last time before heading home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The silence was complete, perfect. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. When she opened them, she looked at the land with gratitude, not for the gold, for the lesson, for showing her that she was capable of more than she'd thought, that she could trust herself, that she could take risks and survive them and come out stronger. That was worth more than any amount of money. The knowledge that she'd faced uncertainty and won, that she'd bet on herself and been right. She got in her car and drove back to Sacramento,